Hey everybody, welcome back to Social World. Hope you all had a great weekend. Well, it's hard to believe that it's already that time of the semester. It is midterm week. We're almost halfway through. Before we get to that midterm on Thursday, we thought it would be a good idea for us to take one day and dedicate it to the writings of Nietzsche, which we've been reading over the course of the Hey everyone, welcome back to Social World. I hope you had a good weekend. Well, it's hard to believe that we're already at that point in the semester. It is midterm week. We are about halfway done. But before we get to the midterm, we thought it would be a good idea if we took one day and dedicated it to the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. We have been reading Nietzsche's philosophy sort of scattered throughout the first half of the semester alongside Thucydides and Plato, mainly as a foil to Socrates. Of course, Socrates believes in the forms of goodness, truth, and beauty, and that we can know these forms. And the only way we can be happy and live a flourishing life is to conform ourselves to these forms. Needless to say, Nietzsche disagrees. And I hope you've had a chance in your small groups, especially when you talked about how the real world at last became a myth, to talk about Nietzsche's deconstructive philosophy, his criticisms of Platonism and Christianity. But we're going to review that really quick here at the beginning before we turn to the heart of the presentation. So really two main goals today. One is what I just said, Nietzsche's deconstructive philosophy, and I think it'll be real clear in a minute why this is really often the main point that people focus on. Nietzsche critiques both Platonism and Christianity, and he makes the argument that they are essentially the same metaphysically. But I want to spend some time on a second point that I think is really important. Nietzsche has a constructive philosophy. Nietzsche makes positive philosophical points and has a positive philosophical contribution to make. It's easy to overlook because the majority of his focus is on deconstructing the Western philosophical tradition, but it's there. And if we read closely, I think that we will see that there are some positive elements to Nietzsche. He really wants us to live a life-affirming existence. He wants us to live meaningful, flourishing lives, and he sprinkles throughout his writings what he sees are some of the tools that can help us to do that. So we'll unpack that in the second part of the lecture. But first, let's focus on the deconstructive half of Nietzsche. You'll see this picture up on the left. Anyone have any guess who that is? Anyone? Anyone? No? No one's going to answer me? Okay, well, I'll just tell you. This is Prometheus. Prometheus, of course, stole fire from the gods, and Zeus punished him eternally by having his liver forever eaten out by this bird. I'm not really sure who I feel more sorry for, Prometheus or the bird. This picture is often on the cover of Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. And that would be a good question you might want to discuss in your small group after this presentation is over. Why put Prometheus on the cover? But I want to focus on a more basic question. Why is this book called Twilight of the Idols? What do you think? Well, we have two main words here, right? Twilight and idols. Twilight indicates that the sun is setting, coming to the end of something. It's a period or an age of decline. So the question then is, what's declining? The sun is setting on what? We're coming to the end of what? Well, of the idols. Okay, well, what does that mean? What's an idol? Well, if you're part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, or really part of the Western intellectual tradition at all, you should know that idols are false gods, like the golden calf. Idols are false gods that we worship in place of the true God. Nietzsche wants to bring an end to the worship of false gods. But what about the subtitle? How to philosophize with a hammer. What do you think Nietzsche means by this? Well, if he thinks he needs to bring about the end, the twilight of us worshiping false gods, then maybe we just need to go ahead and smash them. We need to smash all of the idols, destroy all the false gods. And for him, the false gods really are all the major claims of the entire Western philosophical tradition. Let's read this quote together and maybe we'll get a little better idea. Moral. Everything of the first rank must be causi sui, the cause of itself. Origin in something else counts as an objection, as casting doubt on value. All supreme values are of the first rank. All the supreme concepts, that which is, the unconditioned, the good, the true, the perfect, all that cannot have become, must there be causi sui. The last, thinnest, emptiest is placed as the first, as the cause in itself, as ens realissimum, the most real being. How does this help us understand the twilight of the idols? Nietzsche thinks the idols are all supreme values that we say are the highest, that are the causi sui, that are the most real beings. The good, the true, the perfect. Plato's good, Christianity's God. These are supreme values, the highest beings. He thinks these are false idols. But not just that, not just Plato, not just Christianity. He also has a problem with modern science. Even Darwin is someone that Nietzsche has a major problem with. Why would he have a problem with Darwin? Well, actually, this is an interesting place where Nietzsche and some Christian philosophers can align. The Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga says that the problem with Darwinian naturalism is it provides a comprehensive and ultimate explanation of reality that can replace the Christian explanation. It gives us an ultimate explanation for who we are and where we came from. For Nietzsche, this is a truth, capital T, claim. This is any claim about ultimate explanations are false idols, because we have no access to an ultimate explanation, because there is no ultimate explanation for Nietzsche. He does not think the world offers us any such thing. So even modern science presents an idol, a false god that we are worshiping in place of true reality. So let's look a little closer here then about what Socrates thinks Platonism and Christianity have in common. One of his famous quotes is that Christianity is Platonism for the people. What do you think he means that Christianity is Platonism for the people? Well, we just talked about how Christianity and Platonism are similar, and that they both have a supreme good, a causi sui, a most real being. But maybe there's more to it than that. Plato, Nietzsche says, is so morally infected, so much an antecedent Christian, he already has the concept good as the supreme concept. Both Plato and Christianity are moral realists. You may recall from the first presentation of the year that moral realism is simply the claim that moral truths exist. They are objective, eternal, we can know them, and in order to live happy, flourishing lives, we have to conform ourselves to these truths. Platonism thinks that there are moral truths that exist. Christianity thinks there are moral truths that exist. In some ways, these are part of the heart of both Christianity and Platonism. But he goes even further in this claim that Christianity is Platonism for the people. Let's read this quote. Socrates was a misunderstanding. The entire morality of improvement, the Christian included, was a misunderstanding. The harshest daylight, rationality at any cost, life bright, cold, circumspect, conscious, without instinct, in opposition to the instincts, has itself been no more than a form of sickness. Another form of sickness, and by no means a way back to virtue, to health, to happiness. To have to combat one's instincts, that is the formula for decadence. As long as life is ascending, happiness and instinct are one. Nietzsche thinks that both Christianity and Platonism have a certain kind of anthropology, a certain view of the human creature, of the human being, that our natural instincts are not going to make us happy. We have to, in some sense, be opposed to these instincts. We have to kill the passions, as the Stoics and some of the ancient desert fathers would say. We have to kill these passions, kill these natural emotions in order to be truly happy. We have a picture of a monk with a skull in a cell. Why would the monk have a skull? There's this ancient Stoic and Christian practice known as the remembrance of death. You see the quote at the top, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." We as Christians often hear this on Ash Wednesday at the beginning of Lent, right? You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Why should we remember that? To remember that God created us out of the dust, that God is ultimately the one that is in control, that we are very, very small specks in this grand creation story. It is in order that we might cultivate the virtue of humility. The crown of the monk is humility. Christians and many members of the philosophical tradition, Platonism, Stoicism, believe that there is a sense in which we need to cultivate a virtue like humility, to recognize our proper place in the world. Nietzsche completely disagrees. For Nietzsche, the virtue we should cultivate is pride. Pride and instinct. We will be happy when we are acting on our instinct, when we are ascending, when we are becoming greater and greater. You might ask in your small group after the end of the presentation, what do we do with this disagreement? Christianity says the way to happiness, the way to a fulfilling life, is the life of humility. Nietzsche says no, the way to a fulfilling life is to increase, to become more, to ascend, to increase one's instincts. I want to come back to one other claim here at the beginning. So why does Nietzsche claim that Christianity is Platonism for the people? Well, it is because there's this metaphysical commonality, a belief in the supreme good or God. There's this anthropological commonality, this belief that we should aim for humility, that in some sense what we are on this earth is not all that we're meant to be. But the big difference, the reason that Christianity is Platonism for the people, is that Platonism is a complicated philosophical doctrine. Socrates is a really smart man, and he goes around talking to a lot of other really smart people, and most of them don't get what he's talking about. And some of us have spent much of our adult lives trying to understand Platonism, and we still don't fully get it. On the other hand, Christianity, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. Anyone can deny herself, take up her cross, and follow me. It's not an easy road, but it's not an intellectual road. It's a road that is open to anybody that will confess and believe and follow. Christianity makes this possible for everyone, whereas Platonism makes this possible for only a select intellectual elite few. So that's really summing up the deconstructive aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy, the destructive aspect, the way that he criticizes the entire Western intellectual tradition. But I don't want to just spend time on that. I think it's important that we see that whatever you think about Nietzsche, you don't have to agree with him. You don't have to like him. I have my own battles with him. I'm challenged by him, but he does have positive things to say. He does really believe that there are ways that we can live a more meaningful, fulfilling life. And he does hint at what he thinks the tools would be to lead this life. So here's the three positive points we're going to focus on. These are assertions he makes about reality. The first assertion is, in a way, a kind of negative assertion, although he doesn't see it that way. Nietzsche is the epitome of a moral anti-realist. Of course, we have to ask, what's a moral anti-realist? Well, we just talked about a moral realist being someone who believes that moral truths exist, are eternal, objective, knowable. We have to conform ourselves to those realities to be fulfilled and to flourish. Nietzsche says no, they don't exist. Moral truths do not exist. Well, why can he make this claim? Is it just a bald assertion? Does he have any reasons for it? Let's look here for a minute. as some of the reasons. It is precisely facts that do not exist, Nietzsche says, only interpretations. Think about that for a minute. Facts do not exist? What an absurd and ridiculous claim. I mean, I'm standing here in front of a wooden desk. You can't see it, but I mean, obviously it's here. It's wood. That's a fact. There's a fan blowing on me because it's always hot up here on the second floor. There's a fake beach behind me. These are all facts, right? They're claims I can make. They're empirically falsifiable. How can he possibly mean that facts do not exist, only interpretations? Well, here's kind of a funny look at it. Nietzsche kind of thinks that this is somewhat like our situation in the world. You notice all these people have bandanas around their eyes, and they are given different parts of this poor elephant. And because of their very limited perspective, they think that in fact none of this is actually an elephant, that it's quite different things. They have radically different views of the world because of their different limited perspectives. They have radically different interpretations. But this actually isn't Nietzsche. Nietzsche's view is even more radical than this. For Nietzsche, there is no elephant. The elephant doesn't even exist. This view would be that, well, we all have a confused sort of view of the absolute truth of reality. We all only have access to part of it. It's through our perspective. No, Nietzsche thinks there is no ultimate reality to have access to, no ultimate truth to have access to. How could he think that? Let's read another quote. Judgments, value judgments concerning life for or against, can in the last resort never be true. They possess value only as symptoms. They come into consideration only as judgments. In themselves, such judgments are stupidities. Okay, now we have a little bit better clue what he was saying in the previous quote. It is precisely facts in the sense of value judgments, moral facts. It is precisely moral facts that do not exist, only interpretations. Value judgments for or against can never be true. They possess value only as symptoms. Okay, so these value judgments, we say some things are right, some things are wrong. We make these claims about moral facts. He says those are symptoms. So what is the sickness? Where do the symptoms come from? Let's look at a couple other longer quotes that I think will help us get better at this question of how it is that facts do not exist, only interpretations. So let's look at another quote. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, in which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are, metaphors which are worn out and without sensuous power, coins which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. So what's Nietzsche saying here about value claims, about truth claims, about claims about original explanations? They are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are. Metaphors, a sum of human relations which have become obligatory to a people. I wonder if we could think of an example for this. Well, let's consider a historical example that I think Nietzsche would like. Anthropology has become a big science in Nietzsche's time, and just to be clear, Nietzsche isn't against all science. He's just against science that makes ultimate claims. It tries to provide ultimate explanations. This is a woman from Willendorf, a Paleolithic fertility goddess. This is about 30,000 years old. And this comes about in a time when human beings travel the earth in tribes or bands, and they're hunter-gatherers. In these tribes or bands, we didn't have marriage and monogamy like we think about it now. We probably had pair bonding. We had less children. We had some division of labor, but both men and women were really equally important. The men went out and tried to hunt big game, but a lot of times they failed. The women stayed back. They took care of the children. They gathered fruits and nuts and berries, even sometimes small game. And so you could see why in this kind of culture, you would really value the earth and fertility. You're so dependent upon the earth and upon females in your tribe. And so the goddesses are these fertility goddesses. If we fast forward now about 28,000 years later, in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian myth, we see Marduk and Tiamat. Now, Marduk is a warrior man god who defeats Tiamat, the evil woman god. Why this transformation? Well, some anthropologists and scholars would argue that when we go through the Neolithic revolution and become agrarian, our culture changes fundamentally. Marriage changes. Now we go from pair bonding to monogamous marriage. The importance of children really changes because you have to have children to work the farm. Marriage changes because you want to know who your children are and be able to pass down your property to your children. So we have one man, one woman, children. Monogamy becomes very important. We have a patriarchal society now, and the gods become male. Some people would argue that this is an instance of cultural practices that over time become obligatory. They reinforce the practices and make it feel like these are the moral values of the culture, when maybe they weren't that case originally. So I think what Nietzsche is claiming is that moral truths are actually conventions, something society has constructed. So here's the quote. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors. In moral terms, the obligation to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie herd-like in a style obligatory for all. You might remember the claim from earlier in the semester, Schweter, that the social order is the moral order. Nietzsche actually kind of agrees here that the social order, conventions, right, the way that a herd behaves in a society does become the moral order. The difference is Nietzsche doesn't think there's any moral truth. There's only the social order, but unfortunately, in the process of society establishing itself, these social practices become obligatory moral values. Okay, so point one was that Nietzsche is an anti-realist, a moral anti-realist. Moral values don't exist. Second question, second point is Nietzsche a rationalist or an empiricist? You may recall that many traditional interpretations of Plato interpret him as a rationalist. I mean, for Socrates, how do you access knowledge of our ultimate moral values like the good? You engage in conversations about it. You offer arguments for your position. You show what's wrong with the arguments, and then you offer a better argument. You go back and forth as part of the elenchus and the dialectical progression, and you get higher and higher, and slowly we get closer and closer to understanding what the truth of the form of the good is, or what piety is. It is a logical and rational progression. An empiricist says, no, the way we gain knowledge is through our senses. Let's see which one Nietzsche is. Reason, Nietzsche says, is the cause of our falsification of the evidence of the senses. Insofar as the senses show becoming, passing away, change, they do not lie. Why would he say that reason is the cause of our falsification of the evidence of senses? Well, this might be another jab at Socrates, who really doesn't like the philosophers that come before him. Socrates really wants to grasp something that is eternal. For Socrates, the only thing that is going to be truly true is something that's eternal and objective. Nietzsche says, no, but hold on. What our senses show us is a world of becoming, a world of passing away, a world of change, a world that's in constant flux. And Nietzsche thinks that this is the truth. Our senses show us the way the world actually is. Nietzsche didn't like a lot of philosophers, pretty much everyone after Socrates, up to himself, Nietzsche. But he did like some philosophers that came before Socrates, known as the pre-Socratics. That's how important Socrates is. Heraclitus, one of the famous pre-Socratics, said, "You cannot look twice at the same river, for fresh waters are ever flowing in." And he also says, "Nothing endures but change." Heraclitus is claiming that the world is a world that's constantly in flux, and we are also constantly changing and in flux. So we will never grasp some objective, eternal truth, because we're never even going to see the same thing twice. The encounter between our changing perspective and the changing world will always result in seeing something new. But Nietzsche doesn't think this is false. This is our senses just telling us the best we can what the world is in front of us. It is even a difficult thing for him to admit to himself that the insect or the bird perceives an entirely different world from the one that man does, and that the question of which of these perceptions of the world is the more correct one is quite meaningless. For this would have to have been decided previously in accordance with the criterion of the correct perception, which means in accordance with a criterion which is not available. I'll let you look at that quote for a second. This helps me understand the quote I started off with in this section, which is, "There are no facts, only interpretations." And again, of course, Nietzsche doesn't mean facts about the desk being wood. He means moral facts, truth claims, claims about ultimate explanations. Why does he think there are no facts, only interpretations? Well, this quote clues us in. In order to understand, to grasp a fact, a moral fact, a value judgment, he thinks, we would have to know what the criterion is for the correct perception, and this criterion is not available. We'd have to be able to falsify the moral fact somehow. How would we falsify the moral fact? And maybe another way to think about it is, we would have to have a God's eye view of the world to have a truly objective picture and figure out what the ultimate moral values are. We never have this view from eternity. We never have this God's eye view. And because we don't have the God's eye view, we could never even know whether or not the fact claims we are making are true or not. We can only know what we see from our particular perspective. He goes even more radical than this. One more long quote on this topic. If each of us had a different kind of sense perception, if we could only perceive things now as a bird, now as a worm, now as a plant, or if one of us saw a stimulus as red, another as blue, while a third even heard the same stimulus as a sound, then no one would speak of such a regularity of nature. Rather, nature would be grasped only as a creation which is subjective in the highest degree. Of course, we know now, because of animal science, that a lot of animals do actually perceive the world in radically different ways than human beings do. For instance, this is a guess at what human sees when looking at a bird and what bird sees. Birds can actually see colors that we cannot perceive. If you look at my finger and you try to focus on both my finger and my face behind me, you can only either focus in on the finger or on the face. The bird sees both at the same time. We have very limited peripheral vision and it goes away very fast. The bird sees a much wider range. Sharks can sense magnetic energy. That's how they hunt. Dolphins use echolocation to actually feel things that are way, way far off. I mean, animals perceive a different world than we do. Now, of course, Nietzsche's point isn't really about animals. He doesn't really care all that much. His point is that we as humans are as different to each other as animals are to us. We perceive the world from our particular embodied position in a particular time and place and culture with a particular psychological makeup and personal history. And the world is constantly changing and we are constantly changing. And so what we see is, in the truest sense, subjective. It is based in the subject, me, my encounter with the world. That's what subjective means. It doesn't mean relativistic or that there's no ultimate truth. It means that I perceive something as a subject from my perspective. Now, of course, Nietzsche does think that the result of this is that there is no moral truth and that things are, in a sense, very relative, radically relative. So I conclude here that Nietzsche's is a radical empiricism. Only our senses provide us an accurate view of reality, but that view is always perspectival. We see reality as it is from our perspective, a reality that's constantly changing, constantly in flux, constantly becoming and decaying, and we only see it from our particular perspective. And it's a radical empiricism too, because there's no ultimate conclusion of this empirical investigation. We're not going to just investigate using our senses and get to the point where we finally figure out the ultimate explanation of reality like Darwin thought he did, at least according to Nietzsche. We're going to constantly be encountering this new world and new things about the world. We're never going to finish this process of discovering. So the first 2 points: Nietzsche is a moral anti-realist. There are no moral facts. Nietzsche is a radical empiricist, that our senses reveal to us the world as it is, but this is a world that is seen through our particular perspective, and there is no other way. The last point I want to make is probably the most positive point, and that is that Nietzsche is a naturalistic virtue ethicist. There's a lot packed into that. We don't need to go too far into it. We'll talk more about what a virtue ethicist is when we get to Aristotle. But the basic point is pretty simple. Nietzsche is a naturalist. That means he only believes in the natural world. He doesn't believe any religious explanations, any ultimate or supernatural explanations. He's a virtue ethicist, which means that he thinks what it's going to mean to live an ethical life is to cultivate certain characteristics. There are human characteristics that we should cultivate, that we need to cultivate if we want to be happy, successful, flourishing human beings. Nietzsche does actually think that we can live a flourishing life, and he does have a pretty robust moral psychology. It's just not developed or spelled out really well. So I think it would be a fun exercise to take a few minutes here, and if your small group professor chooses to, you can pause this. And this can either be a writing exercise, or it can be a parent share, or you can get in groups of 3 or 4. If your classroom is one that allows for it, you can have the proper social distancing. In whatever configuration you choose, look for 2 or 3 positive human characteristics that Nietzsche values. So like a positive human characteristic for Christians would be gratitude. Right? We believe that we should cultivate gratitude, that we should approach the world with gratitude, that we should be thankful to God for the grace that's been given to us. We should be thankful to other people, to our parents, the people that have come before us. We should approach the world with an attitude of gratitude. And if we live with gratitude, we are going to be happier and mentally healthier than if we didn't. Can you think or find any positive characteristics in Nietzsche that he values, that he thinks we should cultivate? I think you can. So take a few minutes and do that. Okay, so what'd you come up with? I'd be really curious to hear. Good to hear what my small group thinks. I'm going to throw out a few that I found. These are not the only ones. These are just ones that have stood out in the little bit of Nietzsche that we've read this semester. First one, and probably the biggest one, most obvious one, is courage. One of the first quotes we read when we read Thucydides at the beginning of the semester: courage in the face of reality ultimately distinguishes such natures as Thucydides and Plato. Bravery and composure in the face of a powerful enemy, great hardship, a problem that arouses aversion. It is this victorious condition which the tragic artist singles out, which he glorifies. I think this quote from the late philosopher from the University of Texas, Robert Solomon, really helps. He argues that for Nietzsche, courage is a sense of something to be done no matter what, within the bounds of the appropriate context, in the face of obstacles to be overcome no matter what, within bounds. And many of these positive characteristics, these virtues, blend into others. But for Nietzsche here, courage is the fact that we constantly encounter a world that is unforgiving. We encounter difficult tasks. And if we want to continue to develop and to grow and to become stronger, healthier human beings, we are going to have the courage to face the obstacles in our way. One of Nietzsche's biggest emphases, which didn't really come out in these texts, is he believes that we should engage in a process of self-overcoming. We constantly face things in our way, obstacles that keep us from reaching our potential, right? From becoming the kind of person that we can become. Sometimes these obstacles come from outside of ourselves, and oftentimes they come from within. And Nietzsche thinks we have to have the courage to face those obstacles, to overcome our fears, if we are going to become more and more successful and happy and flourishing people. We have to have courage. A few others here. Self-control. We also read this quote at the beginning of the semester. Plato is a coward in the face of reality. Consequently, he flees into the ideal. Thucydides has himself under control. Constantly, he retains control over all things. You might talk about in your discussion after this presentation, what does Nietzsche mean here by self-control? Life affirmation, or the will to live. Affirmation of life, even in its strangest and sternest problems. The will to life rejoicing in its own inexhaustibility through the sacrifice of its highest types. He thinks we have to affirm life even in its strangest and sternest problems. What does that mean? Well, here's a little longer quote that I think might help. I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who makes things beautiful. Amor fati, the love of fate. Let that be my love henceforth. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse those who accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all and on the whole, someday I wish to only be a yes-sayer. There's a lot going on in this quote, but I think we can get the basic idea. Nietzsche believes that the world is difficult, that it can be unforgiving and painful, but that there's also so much beauty in the world. We have to be willing to see it. In many ways, Nietzsche believes that we have to create the beauty and the meaning in the world, and we can only do that if we are willing to affirm life even in its most difficult. If we are to say yes to life, yes to the world, and we are to continue to move on and engage in this process of self-overcoming. Joy, beyond pity and terror, to realize in oneself the eternal joy of becoming, that joy which also encompasses joy in destruction. Nietzsche thinks this process of self-overcoming and becoming, this development, if you are the kind of person that is working to become a better person, it is difficult and you will engage in trials and you will need courage, but Nietzsche thinks you will be happier if you can find joy in that process of becoming, joy in that process of growing, joy in that process of developing. Even when it's difficult, we have to see the good side of things. Truthfulness or honesty. This is the last one and one of the most important. Honest things, like honest men, do not carry their reasons exposed in this fashion. Well, that doesn't really help us very much. Let's look at a longer quote from a different text. This is from Ecce Homo, one of the last texts Nietzsche wrote. How much truth does a spirit endure? How much truth does it dare? More and more that became for me the real measure of value. What's Nietzsche saying here? How much truth does a spirit endure? How much truth does it dare? Nietzsche thinks that we have to be willing to face the world as it is, to not lie to ourselves about who we are, to not lie to ourselves about how the world is, to not lie to others, but to have the courage to see the world honestly. This probably, whether we agree with him or not, this really goes back to Nietzsche's problem with Socrates. Nietzsche doesn't think Socrates can look at the world the way that it is and accept it. That he has to engage in this whole process of deceit to come up with this other world, this world of the forms, to escape from this painful world that is constantly changing, that is constantly in flux. Nietzsche thinks that we have to be honest about the way things are and have the courage to face the world as it is. Whatever else you think about Nietzsche, I think these are positive points that we could value today, that we should affirm life, we should be yes-sayers, we should have joy, and we need to face the hard truths about our world. I hope you have a good conversation in small group. Thanks.